Fantastic. Well, I think we'll get started. So thanks for coming along today. Thanks for spending your Wednesday afternoon or Wednesday morning with us, depending on where you are in the world. I guess it could be Wednesday evening as well for people people further. I'm not getting my easts and wests mixed up. But anyway, let's get on with it. So thanks for joining today. Going to be doing the webinar on something that I think we've all experienced differently over the past year, which is our work-life balance, or actually our lack thereof. I don't know where you're all joining from, but I'm joining from my guest bedroom, which is a little bit of a change from this time last year. But it's suffice it to say that our working life has really changed, no matter where we are in the world or who we are. Expecting the webinar to last up to an hour today, so we're going to send through a recording afterwards if you'd like to rewatch or share with colleagues. If you've got any questions as we go, and the second half of the webinar is a Q&A, please do add them into the Q&A box and we'll answer them towards the end of the session. And of course, as with all of our webinars and with all of our content, we're going to send around a feedback form afterwards. Please do take the time to fill it in. It's really helpful to help us sort of inform us on what content that you're interested in us putting together next and on improving as we go. So we've got two fantastic speakers joining me today. Lisa Kramer is a business psychologist at Kooth. Kooth are a company that specializes in creating easy access to online mental health services. Now, I believe their practitioners have always been a remote workforce, or have for a long time. And as some of you can imagine, the nature of their work often puts them under immense pressure. So really interested in hearing some of the tactics and tools that you use to help them separate their work life from their personal life. Kooth are also one of our valued clients, so we know just how thoughtful they are around these sorts of issues. So really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Now, Lisa started her career in communications before retraining as a psychologist, and so brings a rare mix of commercial and clinical insights to this particular issue. So thank you very much for joining us. We're also joined by Andy, who is a content marketing manager at Lattice. Lattice are a productivity and people management platform that helps companies to support their employees to grow and progress through their career. Lattice brings a real focus on employee engagement. So really interested, Andy, on the sort of approach that you guys use to help your employees and your clients' employees to disengage at the end of each work day. Should also mention that we are a client of Lattice's and use them to help us track how we're doing as an organization across departments and stay productive. So thank you both so much for joining me today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Felix. I'm one of the founders and co-CEOs of Instant Impact, and we are in-house recruitment experts. We work as an extension of our clients' HR functions and provide them with the team, the expertise, the marketing and technology that they need to make high quality, diverse hires directly. Why are we interested in this topic? You may well ask. It's because, well, our team of embedded recruiters provide us with really valuable insights into the changing nature of workforces, of candidates, and of course of businesses. And one of the trends that we've really honed in on this year, regardless of industry really, is that working from home has completely blurred the lines between working life and home life. When you work from your kitchen, eat from your kitchen, and relax in your kitchen, it's very difficult to have the clear separation that we used to. And that has changed the way that potential employees think about their potential employers and the way that employees think about their employers as well. So the candidates that we're speaking to are really putting more focus and more emphasis than ever on what support the companies that their potential employees could provide They really care about what the plan is going to be after lockdown. And they also really do care about how companies responded during the pandemic and what sort of support they put in place for their employees. So we've been working with our clients to respond to these new demands, to set up new programs and solutions, as well as making sure that all of these things, if positive, are reflected in the employer brand, and if negative, are addressed before they affect negatively in the employer brand elsewhere. So that's it from me and my scene set. I think I'm going to seamlessly stop sharing my screen and let Lisa start sharing hers. So thanks so much for joining us today, Lisa.
Thank you. Okay, let me see if this works.
Good.
It did.
It's loading. I'm just seeing a black screen at the moment. Andy, can you see it?
I just see it says Lisa has started screen sharing, but I don't actually see the screen yet.
Okay, just give me 1 sec. Sorry. Oh.
No problem at all.
I'll try and load it up really quickly.
Sorry, guys.
Sorry, technical issues. We had a dry run through before, didn't we? And it was absolutely fine.
It did. It went seamlessly earlier.
Oh, so awful. Okay, hang on 1 second.
I mean, this is what the new world of work is all about. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
So let me try and share mine. I do have it up on mine. Let me see if this one works.
Okay, mine. Have you got yours there? Oh.
Has that worked?
I can see that, but okay. Should we do that?
Just give me a shout when you want me to change slide, and we'll just use this one.
Oh, fine. Okay, great. I'll say new slide then.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you, Felix. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, everybody. Sorry about that technical start there. Okay, so yes, thank you for introducing me. Just to give you a little bit of background to Kooth for those that don't know too much about it. So we're a digital mental health care provider. It's an immediate and anonymous service for available to all. And what's really nice about it is that we encourage people to access mental health support as early on as they can. We believe strongly that prevention is as good as a cure, and so people shouldn't hang on until they're in a very highly distressed state. And we've been going for about 20 years working with the NHS. We've got about 300 staff, and we floated on the London Stock Exchange towards the end of last year. So, you know, we've been going for a while, and so we have some nice statistics that we want to share with you today. So thank you. The question today was looking at, is it harder than ever to separate work from our personal lives, and would we agree with that statement? So as Felix said before, it's absolutely true. We are all in this sort of crazy new world where we are, you know, those of us who are lucky enough to still have a job are working from home and living obviously from home as well. So before we had work life, and then we had our home life, and that was separate and therefore possibly more balanced. And now we're in this sort of strange situation where our work life and our home life are just merged. You know, can we ever come out of that? And is it all as bad as it seems? I think it's a really important question to address, especially as we go into the new hybrid working. It's probably about to unveil itself come June, whenever we're allowed out in the UK. I don't know what it's like where Andy is on the dates there. So Felix, if you can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, so I thought in order to answer that question, it's probably best to contextualize it and actually say, what was our life really like before COVID? And what was our life like now that we're in this sort of COVID pandemic? And then we can actually answer that question. So Felix, if you just click again onto the next one, we can look again at the pressures of what we had before. It won't come as a surprise to anybody that the technological advancements meant that we were pressurized. We had access to our laptop and our phones and all the digital revolution stuff that was amazing, but it meant that we never were off work. We were always on. It was like an always on culture. That's what people called it. And that came with its own pressures. It came with that huge amount of time pressure to respond to your boss because he sent you an email, and you have to respond quickly. There's email etiquette. There's no point leaving something in your email box for 3 days. You have to, I start off with, oh, I'm so sorry, I haven't responded earlier. So the pressure mentally, the cognitive load that we were walking around with was just huge. And people were talking about anxiety levels and burnout. That was already happening. That's where we were at. I think it was partly compounded to some extent in some organizations by the leadership and management. So if you have an organization where they pay lip service, if you like, to having this separation of time, but you've got people who are, striving up that, ladder and they want to do really well, they're always on and they're always responding to stuff. And so then their employees or their line reports feel the pressure to keep up with the boss and with their manager. So actually that sort of didn't help. But in amongst all of that, that's the sort of working scenario in which we're dealing with. But we had our own mental health. We walk around with mental health all the time, whether it's good mental health or bad mental health or anywhere along that continuum. We have mental health, and things like your age, your sex, your genetics, hereditary factors, your predisposition to certain types of presentations were there anyway. So that's where we were at. So Felix, if you just move on to look at working in the pandemic, and we'll go straight to the pressures. I mean, I'm not going to go too long on this because everybody, next slide please, will know that we have all those original pressures, but we had some additional, well, primary and secondary stressors such as sick family members, kids at home, health concerns, general health anxiety, financial issues. All those compounded an existing pressurized, stressful work scenario. And of course, we had our contextual mental health issues because they haven't changed. We still were, the same person. We still had our same propensity to mental health issues depending on genetics, and our environment changed. That's really what happened. So in order to answer the question, has our work-life balance become so imbalanced based on the additional mental health pressures, then, let's look at what the statistics tell us, because that maybe will help us answer the question. So if we go into the statistics slide, so these are stats from Kooth. We call it the health of the nation. They're based on 2020 figures, so last year compared to the year before. And obviously 2020 was when the majority of the COVID stuff started in March last year, and when the first lockdown in the UK was. So you'll see two lines of numbers. The first line is for children and young people. It's interesting for you to see it, but mostly I'm going to draw your attention to the bottom row of figures, which is the adult market. And for us, that's anybody over the age of 18. The one box on the left looks at students, which is a whole debate in itself. But the interesting box really for us to look at is the middle box, and probably the one on the right-hand side, just to see the increasing presentation of issues that adults are experiencing since in this COVID period. I mean, just staggering results. So you can see the anxiety and stress figure there has increased by 54%. People coming onto our site are talking about family and relationship issues. They're talking about loneliness because people, don't live with other people. They're experiencing that huge amount of loneliness, which is really then linking onto this sadness figure, which is up by 87%. Which is huge, and then the top line there just reiterates that fact. So all these things may be containable, just about, but sometimes when they spill over into suicidal ideations and suicidal thoughts, 28% of all adults or presenting adults with an issue were talking about that they've experienced suicidal thoughts. So that's hard to get your head around those figures really, but the general message is there has been a massive strain on our mental health. That's not surprising, of course it's not. But what is interesting from an employer's perspective is we want our employees to come into work presenting them their best selves, because at that point they're going to be functioning highly, they're going to be productive, they're going to be engaged and motivated, and then we're going to get great performance out of them, and that's going to be good for the organization. But when looking at the last box there, 24.4% are saying they've lost motivation due to mental health issues. That means at any one time, if that is the only figure that you're looking at, and the other sort of 75%, so 3/4 of your organization are only motivated and 1/4 aren't. That's only for the people that tell you. There's a large number of people that are not going to explicitly, you know, put their hand up and say I'm suffering. That's the stigma with mental health, which we can come to at a later stage. But you know, this means for organizations, they've got problems. People are coming into work with increased problems. 48% of people are saying that they're having that difficulty. So going back to the original question, you've got your work stuff, you've got your home stuff, and you've got your mental health stuff. And that mental health element is that overarching element that impacts on different parts of your life. And so clearly, when you're in this situation where your work life and your home life are sort of merged, and you've got an increased or a degrading mental health situation, what does that mean for us? And that's a question that we really have to ask as we go into this new hybrid state of work, where some people will be working from home, some people will be going into the office. Is that in itself enough to rebalance and recalibrate our home life and work life balance? So I think it's a very difficult question. We can't possibly just do it justice, you know, in the few minutes that I've got to chat, and hopefully we'll be able to open the debate and include Andy in this too. But I think, you know, all is not lost. And, you know, from a Kooth perspective, yes, we have a large number of service delivery people who work from home. They all mostly had done. We do have a small face-to-face operation that do go into schools and do see people. So we do have some of that contact that then had to go home. And a large part of our service support staff had to then work from home. So some were used to it and some weren't. But I think what's important for organizations now is that mental health, employee mental health now is so high up on the agenda, and understanding what we've been through in the last year, the psychological distress that people will have felt in greater or lesser extent, is really key. And it's brilliant that organizations will now sit up and really take note. And what they'll realize is that unless they address this issue in some way or form, then they're going to have problems with their staff. Remembering those figures that we saw before, they're going to have motivational problems, they're going to have engagement problems, and they're going to have performance problems. So organizations that get this right, that find the right solutions to give to their staff, will be the winners. They'll be the ones who'll be able to see engaged staff, and then ultimately they'll be the high performing organizations. So that's great. So, you know, not all is lost. And I think if we start to recalibrate some of our mental health issues, then maybe we can start to get better working lives, better home life balance, and then ultimately there'll be a knock-on effect. That's where we want to get to. So from an organizational perspective, and what we try and do at Kooth is to help our employees by thinking of creative ways to support them, especially with remote employees. I think the most important thing that we found that works for us is setting boundaries. It's very important for the clinical team who are working at that front end, at that cold face, if you like, dealing with our users that are coming in. They're also presenting with high risk type presentations. So it's important for our staff to be able to boundary the work that they do, to give themselves some downtime, to know when they're working on shift and when they're not, and to be able to separate those spaces. And we always try to ask, in fact, we did this in a recent huge recruitment drive that we did with Felix, but with some of the candidates, we asked them, where are you going to be working? You know, like Felix said, are you working at your kitchen table? But sometimes if you have that space that you can then, even if it's behind a sheet, you know, like, you know, in a small space in the corner of a living room that you leave dedicated to work, that means that you can come away from it and have that physical separation. So that's great. I think we're also recognizing that we are moving into this hybrid working scenario for our organization. And I think that will change. What that looks like for each organization will change depending on the organization and depending on what your employees want from you. So the best advice I would give there would be listen to your staff, listen to what their needs are, and try and work around it in whatever way you can. And I think really it's important to see employees in context. What we do well at Kooth is that we see each of our users as an important person in their own right. And I think if you extend that into your employee base, that you look at each person, look at the pressures that they're coming to work with, and look at their context, you'll be able to support them in the best way possible. And I think really the final two messages for us would be to say that leadership support is absolutely imperative. The people that are going to get this type of stuff through the business is is the managers. They are absolutely pivotal at this point in our working lives, and getting them on board, having sort of collective ownership, having top level sponsors of people to support mental health and to support a compassionate workplace will be absolutely key in making sure that this actually goes through. And then communicate to your staff, have that constant communication with them, explain to them what your mental health programs are, try and reduce any of that stigma. I mean, we're in the mental health business, so we don't have any stigma accessing mental health facilities, but in other organizations, I know that's not always the case. But, you know, put the positives out there for having that opportunity to speak to somebody and offload and try and catch it as soon as possible, because prevention is really important. Early prevention is huge. That's it.
Thanks, Lisa. I was just checking to see if you had one more slide on there. That was really, really interesting, and I'm sure there will be some follow-up questions from everyone else. But before we get there, Andy, and I'm sure we're going to move more and more into the solutions part of the question. But I wonder whether you had anything to add on some of the additional challenges that you've seen with working from home, lockdowns, and beyond the sort of the mental health element.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a great presentation, Lisa. Full disclosure, I'm not an organizational psychologist. So when it comes to psychology, you have to take what I say with a grain of salt. But I will say that just kind of from my own experience, and also looking at what our customers are dealing with, you know, it's been hard. It's been hard to really establish that 9 to 5 barrier. I think for a lot of companies that were already remote, they kind of had practice in this. So some of these issues aren't necessarily new. I think companies were talking about burnout and like setting boundaries well before COVID, but everything that's happened over the last 12 months has really put things into overdrive. Looking at some of our own survey data across all of our clients and the survey data or the surveys that they're running with their employees, we're seeing burnout as a key theme. Burnout has definitely been on the rise. And then surprisingly, another element too is just psychological safety. I think with all the furloughs and layoffs over the last year, company or employees are just not as comfortable talking about career opportunities, development. So there's a real reluctance to kind of have those conversations. And I think there are certain individuals beyond just like that maybe are psychologically positioned to have these concerns, that are just in a situation where maybe they're starting a new role at the company, right? The first few weeks of any new hire's job is super important. You're establishing those relationships with people. You're kind of trying to validate your decision to yourself for joining the company. And I think one thing we've observed is that new hire onboarding and making sure that those individuals feel comfortable and heard is very, very important, especially if they'll likely stay remote for the long term. So just a few observations from my end.
That's really interesting, and I'll look forward to getting onto some of the new hire onboarding in a second. So Lisa and Andy, you both mentioned a couple of elements around the sort of cognitive load. Lisa, you mentioned, and Andy, you mentioned burnout becoming an increased issue. I wonder whether, and I wonder whether you guys have any tips on. I think a lot of us know some of the best practice around. Okay, well, stop reading your emails at 6 and meditate and go for a run. And I think if you asked 10 different people, there'd be quite a lot of crossover in how to avoid these things. So I think quite a lot of us know the hints and tips. Well, how do we actually go about actually doing these things instead of just knowing how to do it? Andy, do you mind having a first stab at that one?
Yeah, absolutely. Lisa, in your presentation, you mentioned the role of managers. I think managers are really going to be instrumental here. I know when it comes to burnout and work-life balance, we tend to look kind of in HR's direction. I think to some extent, like, yes, HR will be there to establish some of the systems and processes, like we're going to, do one-on-ones with this frequency, we're going to run these engagement surveys, but it really falls to the managers to, make sure that they're checking in with their employees, depending on the company size. Like, we like to do a weekly basis just because we feel like that's a good cadence, that you're running those surveys, rather than just have like big standalone engagement surveys. Running pulse surveys more frequently can kind of give you a week to week look. And it's really just about checking in, communicating, going out of your way to establish those connections when it's so easy for anybody to kind of take a step back and just hope that the work's getting done, and then everybody's feeling good. But I think it's safe to say that that's not really something you can assume after everything we've gone through.
Absolutely. And what do you think, Lisa? Any
Yeah.
to add on that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, burnout is a huge issue. I mean, we all started off almost from scratch again, because we are in this new situation. I mean, not now, but at the beginning of COVID, when we were sort of all in this lockdown situation, to re-establish what we would call is a psychological contract. So what is the contract between you and your employer or your line manager? Like, what is it that they're expecting you to do? What are the pressures on your time? If you've got to homeschool kids and whatever, you're not going to be able to be as productive. So it's kind of having those honest conversations. I don't think it's ever too late to have those conversations, by the way, because people's situations change all the time. But it'd be nice to be able to have open and honest dialogue with your line manager to re-establish what we would call the psychological contract. What is it that you expect me to do for you? When do you expect me to do it by? And what is realistic? And by setting those boundaries and making it absolutely clear, and sort of trying to adhere to them, and having, as Andy says, those constant communications with the people around you to say, this is working for me and this isn't, you should be able to reduce some of that pressure. And in theory, if you're trying to do 1.5 people's jobs, well, like if you're a mum and, or a dad and, trying to be a carer for some parent and trying to be a teacher and trying to be a worker, you're just doing 3 people's jobs. You have to be able to say, this is what I can do before I burn out. And I think that comes from honest dialogue.
And do you think that renegotiation of the psychological contract, or the resetting of those boundaries, do you think that was a process that was already happening pre-pandemic, or do you think that's something that's happened solely because of COVID?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because when people from the literature, they would say that if your organization changes, it's like an unwritten contract, isn't it, between you and your employment. And when those things change, you can get very upset, or your motivation levels will change, or, things will change and you won't necessarily be as engaged. So I think it's always useful to readdress that. So you can do that in one-to-ones, you can do that in half-year reviews or yearly reviews. I don't know whether it's been particularly apparent for organisations that have had to move online, but I know that with remote working, you're not there with your team, so you can't necessarily see their productivity immediately. So you kind of have to reset, how are you now going to monitor your employees? Is it going to be through productivity, or is it going to be hours that you're logged on? And even if you're logged on, how do I know that you're there and engaged? So I don't know if it's particularly now, or whether it should be done all the time. I don't know if Andy's got a view on that.
Yeah, just a general observation. I feel like prior to COVID, we had written a lot about kind of how the relationship between employees and employers has changed. Employees are in control, etc. And I think a lot of folks thought that that was kind of done in early 2020, when companies started cutting back budgets. HR teams didn't have the resources that they had prior to that. But, fast forward 12 months, I think that dynamic hasn't changed. Employees are still like the key parts of this equation. And the companies that, opt to not make mental health a priority, or not make engagement a priority, are ultimately going to lose out to those that do. Out of everything that's transpired, there are going to be companies that get it and companies that don't. And if you want to still, remain relevant and be considered a great place to work, you have to have learned something from all of this. So, just my 2 cents there.
Oh, good 2 cents. And I'd definitely like to get a little more information on that one from what you're finding at Lattice and the conversations that you're having and the sort of thoughts that you're putting together. You mentioned sort of companies that get it will do really well. What are the sort of hallmarks of companies that get it, and what do you think the sort of future of flexible working is going to look like post pandemic?
Yeah, I think a large part of it is just investment in HR. You can learn a lot about sort of the reporting structure of the people team if the head of HR, the head of the people team reports directly to the CEO. I think that's kind of a sign that that organization, at least at the leadership level, understands the value of engagement and work-life balance and avoiding burnout. But a lot of it you can also tell just by looking at the careers page of a website, the kinds of programs and initiatives that companies set forth to really support employees. And it's not just about having those as an option. So one company I like to use as an example is Webflow. They're a web design tool based in San Francisco, but they consider themselves remote first. Basically, you can work from anywhere, it doesn't matter. But they have policies in place that actually incentivize you to disconnect. So a lot of companies have, what they call unlimited vacation policies, like we have one at Lattice, but that doesn't necessarily alone send the message that you should be doing this. You should be taking time for yourself. Webflow gives you $1,000 to take a vacation for that lasts longer than 5 days, which maybe a little bit of that can come across as like marketing or employer branding, but I think it's just an example of like one way companies can really demonstrate that they take this seriously. One other thing, just to throw in another example, at Lattice, we recently added these recharge days. So in addition to the holidays that we've already got, every month for one day until the end of summer, we have kind of this floating mental health holiday. And I think honestly, beyond the pandemic, we'll probably hang on to those just because business hasn't been disrupted and employees need it, especially after everything that's happened.
That's really interesting. I think one of the things that we often find with our clients is, those sort of creative ways of thinking, and really there's a close line management that you're close enough to know when your team needs a break, are really, really key in getting this right. I think the other thing that we found that's key, and Lisa, I'd like to get your opinion on this one, but in the UK, I think I would say that there is a continued stigma around mental health issues. I'm not sure how that reflects in the US and North America, but one of the things that we find to be really powerful is when senior leadership in an organization become more vulnerable around their own experience with mental health, and sort of share with the organization. And Lisa, I wonder whether you've seen how important you think it is for business leadership to, I suppose, combat the taboo of mental health issues.
Yeah, it is a massive ongoing stigma, unfortunately. Although having said that, I do think the whole COVID thing will probably have changed it, because we've been all impacted to some greater or lesser extent in regards to mental health and our reaction to it. People talk about post-traumatic stress consciously or unconsciously in regards to that, and how we will, recover from it. So in terms of leadership and how organizations should respond to it. I think we need to absolutely tackle the stigma of any adverse reaction to mental health. I think the most important thing to do is to validate people's issues and understand that maybe you haven't been in that situation, but it doesn't negate how somebody else is feeling. So that's the most important thing, is to validate it. And in regards to leaders, sort of showing their vulnerability, showing their authenticity, I think people respond very well to that in the UK, maybe abroad as well. But I know that some organisations that put mental health as one of their values right at the top of the organisation, and have sponsors, visible sponsors within the organisation that back any mental health programme, they're the people that succeed. I think in addition to what Andy was saying before, you have to be able to ask the right questions. So it's great that you guys have wellbeing days. I love that. We have it for ours, for our service delivery staff too. And that's absolutely fantastic, because sometimes you just need a duvet day, let's be honest. But I think, there's a lot of work that needs to be done constantly in that line management, line reports, dyad, that interaction between those people within the organisation, which is recognising the signs of when people are not performing quite well, and learning to deal with that compassionately and sensitively, to just to be an empathetic leader.
Absolutely, and Andy, I think you were nodding through some of that, but do you see some of those themes globally as well, and in the States?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of it, again, to Lisa's point, comes to how leadership thinks about mental health and actually expresses their own sort of challenges. Our CEO actually just sent a company-wide email last week, kind of expressing how he had been feeling burnt out through everything. And he just took a week off and encouraged not just his direct reports, the leadership team, to do that, but to trickle that message down. And by kind of sending that company-wide anyway, it sends a clear message, like, it's okay. You don't have to feel like necessarily you need to prove yourself or sacrifice your own well-being just because you're working remotely, which is, I think, part of the problem when people started to work remotely for the first time. They felt like they needed to put in that extra effort, that extra time to somehow validate their role at the company. And it's okay. Sending that message that it's fine to disconnect, you should take time, is really a big part of making it work. And I will add one other thing. I think beyond just sort of the leadership message, I think it's about setting company norms around setting those boundaries, those divisions. It may sound a little cliched, but we actually published a document internally pretty early on in the pandemic, codifying our company norms now that we're all remote. What's an email? What's a meeting? Like, do you really need to schedule time with somebody at 5 p.m. On a Thursday? Like, can it wait? How you interact with colleagues that might be in a different time zone. Having those written down goes a long way than just hoping that those are kind of established norms socially, just because it sets those formal boundaries and sends a message that this is how the company does business.
That's really interesting. And obviously Lattice is all about productivity. It's all about managing workflows, all the rest of it. I wonder whether you could give us a quick meeting, email, phone call 101. What would you recommend you try and avoid, and what would you recommend you try and limit to an email or whatever?
Yeah, I think I might be borrowing somebody else's line, but the majority of meetings could probably just be emails. I think there's some things certainly worth meeting about, but at Lattice we have kind of the standard rule: if you email somebody, like, expect a response within 2 days. You don't have to expect them to respond that day or immediately. For simple one-off requests, just send a Slack. If you have a question, just a very quick question that can be answered in a sentence, send a Slack. But in regards to meetings, like, we usually reserve those for project kickoffs or maybe more thorough status updates. Really, this isn't just because we're Lattice. we take the position that your most important meeting of the week is the one-on-one that you have with your manager, because you're going to be talking about a few different things, not just like from the productivity side, but also from how you're feeling. So we would much rather have that be the key focus on managers and direct reports calendar.
That's really, really interesting. And obviously, as a user of yours, I know how important that sort of manager meeting is. Lisa, so we've been talking about a lot of the proactive steps that businesses can take. Have you seen any steps that you recommend businesses maybe try and stay away from, sort of pitfalls and things that don't work?
So I think ignoring the above would probably be a huge pitfall. I think that people pay lip service to some type of mental health provision, and they don't really get under the skin of it. They don't necessarily have the right thing for their employees. It won't be the right thing for all employees. It'll be different for some parts of the business, depending on the divisions within your organization and how they interact. So so for example, our service delivery team, they interact with each other a lot because they have to, and they're talking about users and, should we escalate this into a safeguarding issue? Should we identify this as a governance issue? Whatever it may be, they're always communicating. It's actually to not have those communication times would be detrimental to that division. So I think an organization, the main pitfalls would be if they don't think sensibly, what can I do for my employees that will help them and engage them and motivate them and get them performing well? And it might be different within teams. That would be a huge pitfall. I also think that leaders and managers of any team of any size need to start readdressing the status quo. So if they hadn't particularly bothered about, properly listening to their employees or using those one-to-one times to talk about perhaps a mental health element, like Andy was saying, throw that bit in. It doesn't always have to be about learning and development opportunities or the current projects you're working on. These are missed opportunities to get under the skin of your employees and to identify when there are problems. So I think leaders have to now start changing how they're interacting with their employees within the organization.
Anything to add on to there, Andy?
Yeah, I think the biggest pitfall that companies can fall into is thinking that we can go back to normal, that this is just a temporary situation. The solutions that we come up with today will only apply today, and then we can somehow turn back the clock and go back to business as usual as it was in 2019. I think that's really the key issue. This is not about going back to normalcy. This is about understanding that the future is going to be a completely different thing. These are lessons that we've learned throughout all of this, and we have to actually apply them. So yeah, I think that's the biggest trap. And companies that are drafting their return to work or hybrid work plans right now are kind of falling into one of two camps. So they're either going back or moving forward.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It's something that we're seeing so much in the market at the moment is companies who are trying to, really thinking around what the future is going to hold for them, and the companies that are really going to benefit from over the next sort of couple of years are ones that are, I guess, take the time to step back and think about the opportunities that have been created over the last year. Obviously, it's been a horrible time for all of us, but in dealing with that horrible time, we've all been inventive and flexible. And as Lisa said, we've formed new contracts with each other, not just at work, but I've got a new contract with my wife that I don't speak too loudly on webinars when she's on a call. I just remembered that one as we were going. But our relationships have changed so much. I think the companies that are going to do the best are going to be the ones that take the positives and move it forward going forward. So I think it's over 70% of companies that we're talking to are planning on building hybrid working environments, and the vast majority of candidates that we're speaking to are putting flexibility around working style and working location as one of their top 3 most important factors of jobs. So all of this stuff's going to seep into employer brand, and I absolutely agree. It's not going to it's not going to backslide into how things were back in 2019. It feels like a decade ago. Just as we're starting to come into the end of the webinar, I wonder whether, Lisa, I'm going to start with you. What do you think are the key insight? If people came away with one lesson, what would you want that to be from the webinar today?
Yeah, so a key insight, I think embrace change. It's happening anyway, so you might as well go with it. Actually, no, I'll change that. The key message should be put mental health on the top of your agenda and make it part of the values of your organization. And then once that happens, everything else will filter through.
Oh, I do have to actually ask a follow-up question on that one. Obviously, Kooth is all based around mental health provision. So I think it would be remiss of me not to ask this question. How important is it for businesses to have a professional setup, whether it's Kooth or someone else, that they can then refer their team to? And why do you think that's important? Why do you think that's the business's issue rather than the employees themselves?
I mean, that's a great question. You probably know what I'm going to say. The problem is, in the UK, let's say you're an average normal person and you are suffering from mental health issues and you need to get some mental health support. And you don't want to tell anybody about it, but you go to your GP and your GP says, okay, great, and I can put you through to somebody, but it's going to take 18 months to get you through to on the NHS, and you don't have private healthcare and your organisation doesn't have any access for you to access that mental health. During those 18 months, I can guarantee that you will probably have some degradation in your mental health. It will impact on so many areas of your life, not just on your work life, but on your personal life and everything else that goes with it. It's just too long to wait. So yes, it's great if the NHS, if our society was set up so we are able to provide everybody with access to mental health. But what we've seen with Kooth when it was working with children and young people for the last 20 years is that we were an additional resource into the NHS. They were not able to support and offer their services as far wide reaching as they wanted to, which is why an organisation like Kooth filled that gap. And so actually, yes, it would be great if society could do it, but while they can't, while we're busy paying for everything else that, you know, COVID has thrown upon us and the furlough and everything else, there have to be organisations not dissimilar to Kooth that offer support for people so that they can access help. In addition to which, organisations have the responsibility to look after their staff. They have like hygiene factors, you know, you make sure that you have access to toilets, for instance, and a little, you know, place that you can have a coffee during the day. These are normal things that organisations have to take on board. Mental health has to be up there if they want to look after their staff and keep them engaged and performing well. This is a necessity. So it's important for organisations to give their employees choice. You can access whatever's out there, or you can access this organisation. What Kooth does is that we give people access to an anonymous service, and we have highly trained professionals that are able to do that. Talking to your boss and your line manager goes a long way to help, but your boss or line manager might not necessarily be a trained professional. Speaking to somebody who is accredited and, you know, registered and verified and everything else, that's going to give you the real support that you need. It doesn't matter where you get the support, people need to reduce the stigma of accessing support and get the support that they need, because it will impact them positively by receiving that support.
I'm glad I asked that question. It's a fantastic answer. Andy, your big insight from today.
Yeah, so I may have alluded to this earlier, but I think a lot of leaders, unfortunately, look at taking care of employees and mental health as this virtuistic exercise. But I think realistically, like, taking care of your people isn't just the right thing to do. It's makes solid business sense. This is something you have to do to stay competitive from, you know, a talent perspective, but also there's no shortage of data pointing to, you know, higher profitability, higher performance, engagement. So that means that companies ultimately need to put their money where their mouth is and put the budget towards these initiatives and these vendors and tools that actually can deliver those results. So don't think that you're just doing the right thing, because this is a key component of business strategy. And as we say at Lattice, people strategy is business strategy. They're one and the same.
Yeah, I mean, in the psychological literature, that's great, Andy, and it's absolutely true. They talk about your employees being your human capital. So if you think about other assets or capital that you would have, you had a broken machine, you would fix it because that makes your widgets work, or whatever it is, your production line function. Like, these are your human capital. You cannot underestimate any cost towards these people, because ultimately they're going to get you what you want, which is a nice, healthy, profitable business.
Fantastic. And I'm going to share my insight from today, which I think came into focus right at the end. But one of the things that sort of occurred to me is, I think none of these elements are new because of the pandemic. It's just brought everything into sharper focus. So I think and I'm a massive optimist in all things, but I think one of the silver linings to the last year is maybe that businesses and people have realized that there's no such thing as your mental health at work and your mental health in your personal life are exactly the same things. And I think just being able to literally physically see into people's homes when they're at work has really, I think, subconsciously rammed that home. Certainly for me and for some of the companies that we speak to. Well, that's it. I'm going to wind us down, but first of all, thanks so much for joining. And I hope that everyone takes some time out to join us next time. Massive thanks to Lisa and Andy. Such interesting answers and such thoughtful expertise. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to quickly plug our upcoming webinar. We've got one on Wednesday, 24th of March, 11 a.m. around building an inclusive early careers program and how you can do that. We've got loads more coming up in Q2. We're just finalizing the details there, so we will pop those through in an email. And I believe that we're going to we'll share links to both Kooth and Lattice in the follow-up email, and might even share some stats and resources from Andy and Lisa that were referred to as we spoke before. We've got bags of these webinars on our website. We've got some insights pieces, so please do have a look there. And in the meantime, have a fantastic evening, day, morning, wherever you are. And as if you took one thing away, make sure that if you're feeling burnt out, take some time off, take that day off, take that week off, and look after yourselves. All right, thanks for joining. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.